Warm welcome to all of you to the last session of the first day of Urban Arc. Thank you for being around here, and also a warm welcome to the online participants. So most of this panel is online. They're there, and you can see them on the screen. And actually, Gitika is going to be moderating. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Gitika to lead the session. Over to you, Gitika.
Thanks, Kavita. Good day, everyone. A warm welcome and many thanks for coming to this session, which I'm sure is late for many of you. My name is Geetika Anand. I'm currently doing my PhD at the University of Cape Town, and that's where I'm sitting in the moment. I've been working with IIHS since 2010 across its research, teaching, and practice programs. And just to say that, as we strive to walk the talk of reflecting and theorizing from practice, this panel discussion is a very special one for many of us at IIHS. In this panel, which is titled Urban Transitions in Practice, Reflections from a Large-Scale Sanitation Program, we'll use almost a decade-long Tamil Nadu Urban Sanitation Support Program, TNUSSP in short, going forward, as the starting point. And you really examine the lessons that it holds for urban transitions, particularly for transitions that span across multiple cities and scales, and also in terms of what we did, scaling from a niche innovation in the form of demonstration in 2 cities to state/province level system-wide change. In the recent years, we have seen there's considerable discussion on urban transitions, whether it's in policy or in the academic research. But the real-life examples of how these urban transitions pan out in practice have been rarer. And the existing case studies that are out there are mostly drawn from the global north. So through this panel, we want to initiate a dialogue to think through transitions in practice from the vantage point of Global South. After a decade of experience, and in this moment where little bit time is still left in that SDGs commitments, it feels timely to reflect from a program that enabled successful transition from incomplete sanitation systems that actually had aspirations of complete dependence on centralized systems to now where it's a mix of decentralized and centralized systems working at scale in the Indian state of Tamil Nadu. More importantly, we want to use this opportunity to put TNUSSP's experience in conversation with research and practice experiences from other sectors as well as geographic contexts of the Global South. And to that effect, to start this dialogue, we have 3 speakers in this panel. We have Kavita Wankhare, who you can see in the room. We have Colin Marks, who you can see in the virtual room. And we have Edgar Peterse, who also you can see in the virtual room. I'll go over their bios fairly quickly, but I mean, if you know the sector, you know that all of them are like amazing people and have done amazing work over the last many decades. Kavita Wankhare has worked as a researcher, educator, and practitioner in urban India for over 15 years, with training in the social sciences, urban design, and architecture. Primary focus of her work has been on enabling large-scale systemic transformations by managing and working with diverse stakeholders. Kavita is the project director for the IIHS-led TNUSSP, as well as the citywide inclusive sanitation project, in short called CWISE. In addition, Kavita also wears the hats of Associate Dean of IIHS School of Systems and Infrastructure and the head of the IIHS Practice Program. Dr. Colin Marks is Professor of Urban Development Planning and the PhD Program Director at the Development Planning Unit, University College London. A town planner, adult educator, and geographer by training, Colin has extensive experience in community-driven struggles against inequalities in African cities. A consistent focus of his work has been how to identify and act in relation to power relations that produce or sustain urban inequities. In his work, Colin explores how power is mobilized, sustained, and used to generate urban environments through the conditions of impoverishment and informality that characterize many cities of the Global South. Professor Edgar Peterse is the founding director of the African Center for Cities at the University of Cape Town. His practice across research, teaching, and curation explores urban imaginaries, alternative futures, sustainable urban infrastructure, placemaking, public cultures, responsive design, and adaptive governance systems. Edgar's scholarship is animated by a need to make sense of the ways in which climate change, multidimensional inequality, informality, governance, and technology intersect in urban spaces, especially in Africa and other cities of the global south. He's curious what multiple solutions and pathways for advancing sustainable and vibrant cities might involve as acts of exploration and doing. We couldn't have had a better panel, I feel like, and something which I noticed in all the three series was like these one across like multiple types of practices, but also like multiple trainings that each of the panelists have had. It's quite exciting. But before I actually ask our speakers to share their reflections, I would request Mahima Vijendra, who is a senior consultant with the practice team at IIHS and a core team member of the TNUSSP, to provide a brief overview of the program and lay the much needed foundation for this panel discussion. Mahima is also a development sector professional with over 15 years of diverse experience as our panelists, and it ranges from development planning to sustainability to environmental services, including water and sanitation. So over to you, Mahima.
Okay, so this is just to set the context for what Kavita will be speaking to next, about the Tamil Nadu Urban Sanitation Support Program, which was a large program that was launched in 2016 to support the government of Tamil Nadu to scale sanitation across the state. The focus of the program was to address gaps across the sanitation chain, which is what is illustrated here, through primarily fecal sludge management. And FSM was for the program, the program was aiming to see implement FSM as an alternative to network sanitation. And the objective was to look beyond toilets and to see that there were many other components to the full cycle of sanitation that included capture, conveyance, and treatment and reuse or disposal of the wastewater that is generated. And to address these gaps across the sanitation chain, what TNUSSP was aiming to do was initiate multiple forms of interventions, and the interventions were ranging from engineering, capacity building, behavior change, community engagement, governance, as well as work with multiple stakeholders. And there were a whole range of stakeholders, from government to the public households, private players, enterprises who were part of the service provision, as well as sanitation workers. And the program itself was operationalized through a technical support unit, and IIHS was heading this technical support unit, and there were several other partner organizations that were involved in the delivery of the program. And as part of the program design, one of the key features was that it was not only about resolving the challenges and the weaknesses that were there in the context, but also to leverage the strengths, the opportunities that were there, to build on them and not treat the context as a blank slate. And that was a very key feature of the program design. And as you can see here, there were several strengths that were identified across the chain, and this included existing infrastructure that could be better utilized, to existing service providers who were providing a valuable service but could definitely be streamlined or strengthened further. And the other key feature of the program was about functioning at two scales. So one, you had about the different types of urban locations that were there in the state. So you had small towns, several small towns to the scale of 500 plus, and you had several large cities as well. And you had to demonstrate that FSM was viable in both these types of locations. Viable both as a complementary solution to the existing network sanitation, but also as a standalone system in areas in the smaller towns where these didn't exist. And the second approach was to simultaneously work at the state level, where you are scaling whatever you're demonstrating, and you're also intervening through policy and strategies that would help implement what has worked in other cities and towns across the state. So the starting point for the program was about creating treatment infrastructure. And this is often, where things start, but it was not about only focusing on the treatment infrastructure. It was still about looking across the full chain, but the treatment infrastructure was certainly important, because where would the waste go? Even if you capture it, collect it, and transport it, it had to go somewhere where it would be treated and not let out untreated into the environment. And so this was the key gap. And using technology that responded to local conditions, as limited resources in terms of capacity or skills, FSTPs, fecal sludge treatment plants, were built across the state. And simultaneously, we focused on other components of the sanitation chain, as I mentioned. So this included working on improving access to everyone, particularly the urban poor, by strengthening the community and public toilets, the management, so looking at service models there, and then securing on-site sanitation systems, which was key part of FSM, ensuring that treated waste is not directly let out into the environment, but it is collected and then conveyed. So working with service providers who are emptying your sanitation systems and then taking the waste to treatment facilities through governance measures such as light-handed regulation and monitoring, but also looking at other service models that could help ensure that services are reaching everyone, including the urban poor. So till date, what has the program achieved? So we have been able to improve access to sanitation services for a population of over 18 million people. We're working directly in over 200 ULBs, but also implementing several initiatives across the sanitation chain, including creating hard infrastructure as well as softer measures that cut across aspects such as capacity building, improving health and safety, and strengthening governance. And what has been really key for the program is the way in which these initiatives have scaled reflects the level of institutionalization that has occurred. And Tamil Nadu has always been a front runner in this, in terms of FSM in particular. It was the first state to adopt a policy for FSM, but it was also one of the first states to include a chapter on FSM as part of an act. And so apart from these legal and regulatory sort of wins and its impact that the program has had, it has also looked at a range of other measures that is helping ensure that FSM continues to function as the program ends and as we as a technical support unit exit from the state. And so we are looking at integrating operation and maintenance protocols into the system, which we've already developed, and ensuring they're scaling, but also IT-based systems that would help track and monitor. And quite importantly, framing roles and responsibilities for FSM, which can get integrated into the existing governance framework. Yes. So this is, just a bit about the program, and I'll pass it on to Kavita.
Thank you so much, Mahima, for doing an exceptional job of presenting, I think, just about 7 minutes. Amazing. I'll now hand over to Kavita, who's been leading the program from day zero, to share her reflections.
Good evening, everybody. Thanks, Mahima, for that. So we are really in this panel hoping to use TNUSSP as a base and then actually widen up in a broader set of conversation across sectors. So what I'm going to do is very quickly lay out what I think are the key lessons as pertaining to the theme of the conference, which is urban transition, but also talk about issue of scale and scaling change, right? So broadly, 4 messages. The first message is context is important. Obviously, there are generic lessons to be learned, else we would not have had this panel. But whatever the lessons we talk about here, we need to understand that they have to be adapted to specific context. There's no context neutrality. And working with context also means that we have to we have to understand both the enabling conditions and the challenges, and sometimes a particular context could be either, and I'll come to that in a moment. So when we were working with TNUSSP, we were very clear that the enabling conditions for us was a very strong, committed government to ensure 100% coverage of sanitation. and also a relatively strong welfare state. Those of you who are familiar with India know that Tamil Nadu is a relatively strong welfare state. But so that was on the enabling condition. But what I meant is that you have to work with the context, and it could be either. So if you look at the issue of autonomy of urban local bodies or cities, if you need to scale, then the cities need to have autonomy. Otherwise, you're in a situation where cities need to implement, but they don't have the decision making power. So you end up going from city to city and nothing scales. And that was actually the case in context of Tamil Nadu, as in all other Indian states. But what we decided to do was to turn that around and say, how can we work with this challenge? And that's why we worked with the cities, but also had to work with the state or the provincial government, and saying that if we did work with the state government, things could peter down and the scale could be faster. And that's the design solution, that you work at both levels. Now, this is also because, like Mahima said, we were working with 600 odd towns, which were very small. If we had designed a program which was just for big metropolitan cities, it could be different. What is the context is also determined by the boundary conditions of the program, and I'll come back to that in another message. The last thing I want to say about the context is that never underestimate the strengths. So Mahima talked about the strengths, and we as practitioners and researchers, including me, we are trained in critical thinking, but sometimes what that means is that we go and find all the weaknesses and don't appreciate the strengths enough. And what we have learned is that even in the most dysfunctional system, which was not the case of TNUSSP, I think it's very useful to look at why that system is the way it is, why the system is stable, because that actually is going to give you levers of change to start to destabilize that system. So there is always something to learn from the existing system. So that was the key message. Then the next one actually is to say, when we're talking about urban transition, and we're talking about intentional urban transition, because through the day we've also looked at transitions from multiple perspectives where things are evolving organically. But if you're looking at intentionality and you're thinking of, then you have to think of scale, right? So the message is that you have to think of scale. What does that mean? That means that we do not take a pilot approach. Now, what does a pilot approach mean? The pilot approach is typically IFI or a non-NGO or a government decide to take up a particular site, a particular village, a particular ward, and say we will do everything we can to make this right. And so what you often have is a solution, perfect solution, but there have been so many resources of either human resources, financial resources, that those things never actually get replicated. And that's why there's a saying pilots never fail and pilots never scale. So then what is the alternative approach? The alternative approach is to, in TNUSSP and many other cases, is to embed scale right from the start, which means you embed it into the government system. So that may not be the most perfect system. That may be a second, not a second best, but that may be a cost-effective solution. But that is what is going to scale, and that is what we try to do. So fine, scaling is important. And then the point comes, what are you scaling? And that seems like a very trivial question, that there is a system and there's a problem and you go and scale it, right? But actually, let's step back and reflect on the nature of urban systems. So if you look at urban systems, whether it's an energy system or a transport system or a sanitation system, it's a system, it's a chain. And the chain is as good as the weakest link. So if the weakest link breaks, the entire system breaks, which means, and especially in today's day and age, when we're talking about transitions, just transition, climate change, we don't have the luxury of just focusing on one piece of the puzzle. You have to change everything simultaneously, right? And really try to change systems outcomes. And this actually gets us to reflect on the nature of innovation itself, because scaling is a term, scaling, transition are terms that are being used nowadays, but these are not the only terms to be used to describe change, right? And development sector across fields like agriculture and medicine have used words like diffusion, extension, etc., adoption. But what was meant there was that you would adopt a specific innovation, usually a technological innovation. And that is what you scale. Now, the current thinking is that you're looking at scaling as a set of interdependent changes that are happening across the system, across hardware, software, institutional reform, rather than a specific innovation. And I think this is very important because your focus changes from promoting a particular technology or a solution to change the system outcomes. And this essentially means, what does this mean? So this means that you have to have multiple initiatives. And this is something Mahima spoke to in the context of TNUSSP, that you have to have engineering solutions, but you also have to have behavior change communication. You have to have capacity building. You had to have change of rules and laws. And that's how it becomes a package. It is often not a neat package. It's messy often, but it is a package of things that you do simultaneously. And this also brings me to the last point on this, is that it means that you have to work with whole lot of stakeholders. You don't have the luxury of saying we'll only work with the government or we'll only work with civil society. We worked with over 24 stakeholders, if not more, in TNUSSP. So that's key message number one, that how you think about scaling, and you're not scaling a specific thing. Key message 3 is there's a difference between scaling and institutional reform, and I'll come to explain this, but I want to say that any program is, how do I put this? Any program is sets boundaries of change willy-nilly, and what is inside it is what you're trying to change. What is outside it becomes the context for your specific program, and that context could change from program to program. But the point is that if it is outside your boundary of change, then you have to either work with that context or work around it. And I can speak best about this through examples of TNUSSP failures. So FSTPs, the shiny things that Mahima showed, they were very much the way we were going to bring about change. If 2 demonstration projects worked, we were going to have many, many more. But the fact is they both failed. And the reason is, and 2 quick stories. The first one failed because of NIMBY issues and vested interest of people not wanting a waste treatment plant in their backyard. And this is a common story across India and the globe. And so there was a court case against the government and we couldn't build. And so how did the government tackle it? So the government said, okay, this has happened, let's forget about this. But in all the other places, 50 odd places that we started constructing FSTPs, we co-located them with resource recovery parks, which is a term for where the solid waste was being processed. And these plants had been there for many years and any issues had been resolved around it. So by co-locating it, you worked around this issue of land potentially. That was example 1. The second example is even more interesting. We had an international design committee to select the perfect design and the perfect vendor for a FSTP in the small town. And it took us over 6 months to get that person. And then construction began. And this is what nobody ever tells you about theory of change. And then after 2 months, the vendor ran away, very simply put. And yeah, and he declared bankruptcy. And so it was going back to the scratch and we had to get another vendor. But what is the point here? The point here is that this happened because we wanted, again, a very good design. And that meant that that vendor was actually not from Tamil Nadu and was for somewhere else. And so nobody, including the government, could do anything about it. And so what the government did was to shift from, don't get stuck in the technical term, from a DBOT model, which essentially means that when you contract, the vendor designs and implements the program. And that's how you evaluate the bids, as opposed to a DPR where the government is saying, here's the design, you just go and construct it. And that meant that you needed construction capacity and not design capacity, which means there were many more local private contractors who could do it. Is that the ideal way? Maybe not, because you, in a way, kind of killed innovations in design. But we got the other 59. No other vendor has run off so far. So I think the point that I'm trying to say is that whether it's land, whether it's contracting, whether it's private capacity in a new field, these are known systemic issues. And there was no way that we could actually try to change it in that period, or we didn't want to try to. And we had to work around it. And that's what I meant, that you could scale things, but not necessarily bring about deep systemic institutional reform on all aspects. And that's a choice you have to make, because you cannot solve everything together. Having said that, sometimes things happen very organically. So decentralization was not one of our objectives. Like I said, it's a centralized system. We all know that the state government hold most of the power, and so do the national government. But what happened in the process is that because fecal sludge treatment plants are small, okay, they are in KLDs typically, as opposed to sewage treatment plants, which are much larger, and they are typically managed by state agency. The moment we brought in FSTPs, it became a local thing that the ULB could manage and construct, and then they had to manage the whole FSM thing, and then the laws got amended. So willingly, what has happened is that sanitation has become the mandate and the purview of the urban local body. So that is an institutional reform, a big one. But we didn't start with these. So these things happen, but draw a very clear boundary of what one is trying to change and what is not. I don't know, Gitika, how I'm doing on time, but I'm on to my last message.
Under 1 minute, but I think you're okay.
Okay, good. Okay, so last message is there is no scale without sustenance. So people talk of scaling and people talk of sustenance. But there is no scaling without sustenance because it's a chimera. And the TNUSSP's pride is that we've survived multiple change of officers. And we survived a change of political regime from two rival parties, and so far we seem to be doing fine. And how did we do this? And there are many lessons, but let's speak about two of them. One is that everybody talks about champions, and no doubt champions are important, and TNUSSP and FSM also had a champion. But you have to convince, align, and train whole lot of people. And so when people get transferred and there are regime changes, you have to start all over again. And I don't want to steal Edgar's thunder, but he's also going to speak about something similar about the problem he faced when he was working. So that's one, that you have to create a lot more people in the system who believe in what the change is happening. And second, what Mahima spoke to is also change it institutionally. So you can't change the institution. So we tried to get, for example, we tried to get more positions created for FSM. We tried to create a dedicated cell, but that wasn't happening because there were serious financial constraints. So we just mapped out the new roles and responsibilities. So that's another thing. Any change happens, it creates new roles, right? And we mapped it out and we said, okay, these are the roles and these are the existing government officers who can do it. And so the learning there is that you have to embed it within the institutions, even if you can't change it. So there are many more lessons on sustenance, but I'll end with that. And I'm just going to I'm just going to recap the 4 messages that context is important. And if you're thinking of transition, scale is important, but think about what you're scaling. It's not a innovation, but you're innovating at scale. And draw the boundaries clearly. You're not trying to reform everything, and that there's no scale without sustenance. And I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thanks, Kavita. Thank you. Okay, great. Our next speaker, Colin, who has seen some of these TNUSSP initiatives on ground, will now share his reflections, but also from his own work, he'll bring in the critical aspects of land and property rights in making any transition happen. I'll hand over to you, Colin.
Thanks, Gitia. Let me see if I can share. Well, thank you so much for the invitation to speak to this panel. I'm going to focus on what kind of lessons I think can be learned if we think about sanitation and land, and in particular in relation to transitions in relation to urban sanitation. And it seems like there are potentially at least 2 strategies for trying to achieve progressive objectives. So the first one would be to open up new pathways to press for social claims. So pathways that haven't been used before, that are not thought about as traditionally in the way in which people have advocated for rights to improve sanitation, for example. The second way seems to be to work with what is already in the social domain and get that working so that people protest when it fails. In other words, this seems to be a way of kind of creating feelings or experiences of a social service that people should have, but don't currently have, so that it's also getting people to realize that they have that right to that service, in this case, sanitation. So I'm going to start by talking a little bit about making some general points and then focus on what TNUSSP seems to have got right, and then end with a few reflections. So in thinking about transitions, we have to remember that they have to happen somewhere. And in the case of sanitation, pipes have runs, tanks have locations, treatment plants must be built, as Kavita was pointing out. Fecal sludge needs to be transported along roads, and so on, which means that land as space and many other things immediately becomes part of any transition process. And this means that the process, which is trying to make things fairer, immediately encounters an aspect of urban society that is deeply and fundamentally unfair and raises a few issues because of the way that inequalities are bound up with property rights to land. So we can imagine a few scenarios where the first one would be where the interests bound up with property rights to land are so strong and entrenched that a proposed transition program can't happen because the political power is too strong or the property interests make it too expensive to happen. Or we could imagine a scenario where the transition is implemented but doesn't really change any inequalities in land. Or we could imagine where a transition is implemented and challenges some kinds of the inequalities that are associated with land. Now, part of the program or the problem that seems to happen is that in the scenarios that I've just sketched out, is they do not challenge a very prevalent view of cities. And that view is that the city is divided into private and public property, and that this mapping of property rights is exhaustive. So clearly, working with a world where cities are divided into only private and public property rights introduces inequalities. The obvious ones in the distribution of land, in procedures for enforcing and securing rights, and who's recognized as holding properties and which rights count. But drawing on Macpherson's arguments about property rights, we need to remember that there's a third property right which exists, and which arguably is a critical property right in making sure that cities function. And this is the property right to common spaces, roads, public squares, sidewalks, parks, and so on. And we could add features of cities like sanitation. So we need to remember that rights to common spaces and features are equally important. And even though the state creates these rights to common spaces, they belong to people and can be considered the strongest form of right to land and space, because whereas we might sometimes have access to private rights or public rights, we always have rights to the common spaces. So as per the introduction that I made, it's this right that can form the basis to advocate for changes and for new ways to press claims to the commonwealth of cities. But what seems to have happened with TNUSSP, whether intentionally or not, is that they found ways to operate with these common rights to land without making it obvious that this is what was happening. So what TNUSSP has done, and what it seems we can learn, and as Mahima and Kavita pointed out, a significant part of the program was working with existing community and public toilets, making use of existing capacity to develop co-treatment systems, strengthening existing formal and informal fecal sludge management systems, and developing technologies that were more reliable and better supported by the state. And reorganizing, systematizing, and reorientating state services, for example, the desludging, to be more supportive. So that meant that you have the results that they pointed to, where people have improved individual experiences and access to reliable on-site sewage systems through fecal sludge management and co-treatment. And they've vastly improved the access of informal settlements to improved sanitation through better and sustainable management of community and public toilets, especially for women. But it's worth noting that these results for individuals have been achieved by working on those aspects of the sanitation system that can be thought of as people having a common interest in the community or public toilets, the shared part of the sanitation system. And as Kavita pointed out, when people's private property rights were affected through the siting of a new sewage treatment plant, issues of NIMBYism stalled the construction. So, reflecting on or from TNUSSP, what can advocates for transitions in sanitation learn? So, clearly, the dynamics of property rights and how they are understood is only a very small part of the huge success of TNUSSP. However, what TNUSSP has done successfully is work with those property rights to common features to get the system to a point where people start to feel the difference in an improved sanitation service, which when taken away, they're likely to protest about. And a good example of that is the institutionalization of fecal sludge management that Kavita was talking about, that now empowers citizens to take urban government to court if that function is not satisfactorily discharged. So in conclusion, this seems to be a very instructive way to achieve equitable transitions in sanitation. Thank you.
Thank you, Colin. As you were speaking about commons, I was also thinking of like maybe transitions as commoning, and not just for the land, but also maybe commoning of the problem. So I keep thinking that why air quality is not handled in Delhi, for instance, year after year we have it and no transition is happening per se. I think because I think everybody is not being affected equally and with the same intensity. And I think once the problem becomes common across, then maybe there is more transition that could come through. Yeah, but thank you so much. And now opening up this dialogue a little bit more in terms of the sectors, but also the scales of intervention. Our next speaker, Edgar, will present and reflect from the work he and his colleagues have been doing on just urban transitions in South Africa. Over to you, Edgar.
Thank you, Gitika. And thanks to the organizers for inviting me to be part of this discussion. So to see the program on the ground, but I have been following it for some time, and in fact, it also forms part of our teaching program at ACC as a case study, which, just to sort of underscore the importance of this particular initiative. So I've been asked to reflect on work we've been doing over the last 2.5 years with regard to urban transitions, and just to reflect perhaps on what some of the institutional lessons might be that has echoes for some of the lessons that both Colin and Kavita has been sharing with us. So I've got limited time to tell a very complex and big story, so I'll just rush through. So the starting point, of course, is that there is this massive global momentum around the idea of just transitions as a way of cutting into the climate change imperatives to try and reduce emissions so that we can stay within a 1.5 degree world by 2050. Both the scientists and the sort of policy leaders in this space, like Aruma, tell us, we've missed that boat already. And at best, we're looking at a 2.5 degree world. Be that as it may, from a formal political and policy process, governments are still working on national decarbonization pathways that is in line with the Paris Accord of 2015. So what South Africa did was it established a presidential climate commission, which is a corporatist body that is initiated by the state, chaired by the president, but has representation from the key stakeholders in society, particularly civil society and the trade unions and private sector voices, and then certain experts, policy experts. They then produced an initial policy framework, which is the publication is to the right there. And as you can see, it sets out what the path might be to achieve these objectives by 2050. And essentially, since South Africa shares India's energy profile, we are 95% dependent on coal for our energy generation in South Africa. What it really inevitably focuses on is a policy or political space to really engage with the winners and the losers in the transition process. So if we have to close down coal mines and we have to try and build out a renewable energy sector, which will have a very different geographical footprint and will involve completely different value chains, what happens to the workers, and most importantly, what happens to the mining communities that depend on these coal mines in particular. So broadly speaking, that falls within the mitigation piece, which is decarbonization. And then, of course, there's the adaptation piece, which is what climate resilient development might be. So most of the work and energy has gone into the just energy transition, which has a whole financing package. And that's a whole nother story on its own. And then there's a set of directives on the adaptation side that have gone to different national ministries to say, how do we rethink service delivery and macro and local economic development? Within that context, we as in the African Centre for Cities at UCT, were commissioned by the Presidential Climate Commission and the City Support Program in National Treasury to help them formulate a just urban transition policy framework. That's the document. We started working on it in 2022. It was finally published after periods of consultation and engagement in September 2023. And I will talk a little bit about the content of this framework and then what the challenges have been to embed this within government practice. So what might be comparatively of interest, and this, I guess, connects up with some of the points that Colin has made around how does one control for systemic and embedded power differentials and inequality. Sort of the approach has been to really disaggregate the justice component of the just transition or the just urban transition. So the Presidential Climate Commission differentiates between three types of justice: restorative, and of course, particularly in a context like South Africa that is characterized by colonialism, and then the particular form of neocolonialism that was apartheid, distributive justice, dealing with some of the points around inequality, and then, of course, procedural justice. In other words, the obligation to ensure that affected communities and all citizens have an opportunity to engage in the calculus about winners and losers and who bears the costs and who will contribute in a redistributive sense. These are, of course, quite abstract, and so we really try to work to extrapolate what this means within the urban context, within this framework. And so this quote from the just urban transition might be helpful. So we argue that the just urban transition will produce inclusive, low carbon, resource efficient, and spatially integrated metropolitan areas. These cities will be better placed to address unemployment, violent crime, especially against women, spatial segregation, tenure insecurity, inadequate infrastructure and service delivery backlogs that render South Africa cities systemically unjust. The metros will also set a template for all South African local governments. So the Just Urban Transition, because it was sponsored by the City Support Program, which is a dedicated unit within the National Treasury to work with the 8 large metropolitan governments in South Africa, that accounts for 65% of GDP and about 55% of the national population. The idea is that if you can drive transformative change there, it's a little bit easier to do it in smaller municipalities. Now, the point we were trying to stress is that you could have both large-scale mitigation and adaptation interventions within the cities and not have a just outcome. And this is what we were trying to wrestle with. So the framework was designed to obviously make sense to municipal practitioners. So these are political leaders and policy leaders that are responsible for the functions of city level government. And so we worked through 5 categories of opportunity. And we then tried to work to demonstrate what did each aspect of the justice framework entail across each of these. I'm going to just show one example to illustrate in the report that you can download, obviously, from our website or the National Treasury website or the Presidential Climate Commission. You can go into the detail of this. But what was important before we sort of disaggregated that is we suggested that metropolitan governments in particular have 3 kinds of levers available to them to drive change or to drive transformation or to drive transition, if you will. The first is in the domain of regulatory instruments. And this is some of the examples that Kavita and Colin have mentioned. And these are cases where you've got to institute new legal norms, new legal frameworks, new regulations, etc., to alter the incentive system and the behavior of both public institutions and citizens. The second, of course, is the money. And in the South African case, as I'm sure it would be also in India, in particular, the intergovernmental fiscal formulas and frameworks is really important to recalibrate those. And then thirdly, the importance of advocacy governance and policy leadership. And, so because this is fundamentally meant to be a deliberative process to come to an agreement about how to reallocate investments so that you get different and more just outcomes, obviously you've got to drive and build different kinds of conversations and react this in different ways. So keep in mind these 3 levers, because then the framework that we tried to build up makes a bit more sense. So remember, these are the 5 opportunities. That's a distributive framework. Then there's the 3 levers. And so how that comes down in the policy framework is in each of those 5 sectors. This is a summary. There's obviously a narrative to each of these. We identify what the opportunities are for South African municipalities. We give examples. These are not meant to be exhaustive. They're meant to open up a conversation with municipal practitioners, examples of what they could be doing, what that could entail. We then code each of these more detailed actions in terms of the justice framework. Is it distributive? Is it restorative? Is it procedural? As a way of calibrating. And then we identify which of those 3 levers of change would apply to implement this. And again, we code it for the justice lens and then give an example of what we think the outcomes might look like if you pull this through in your planning. Now, it's important to mention that we obviously had to find the balance between not being prescriptive, because there's enormous policy capability within South African metropolitan governments, but also be specific enough, because part of our problem is that most metros in South Africa would say we are already doing these things, but the net outcome of that is not just. In fact, inequalities are being reproduced. So I won't go into the detail on this. It was just to illustrate how the framework then works. So to start to conclude then, so if we're thinking about scaling, we had very particular assumptions that we made in building out this framework. So the first was that this technical unit that is meant to be a catalyst for transformative change in the metros, the city support program, we envisage this to be a key tool for them in their next 5-year program of work. So remember, South Africa had an election last year. So this unit was remandated to continue to work with the metros to drive innovation. And we were arguing that this should be a dominant lens for them as they build out their program. Secondly, that the idea of the framework was not to be exhaustive, but to kind of be a benchmark so that the city support program could work with the metros to adjudicate the efficacy of climate adaptation and climate policy frameworks that are already developed. So in the case of South Africa, the usual players are all here. So WRI, C40, et cetera, et cetera. So most of the metros had some policy framework in place. What we wanted to do was to make sure that those are not so generic and aligned with global policy norms that they fail on the justice component. So the idea was to say, we recognize you've done significant work in the metros, but can we have a conversation about the just outcomes, the efficacy of it? And then, of course, it should be a basis for learning, because nobody really knows how to do this given the constraints of resources, the path dependencies of existing institutional formats, and so on. And then, most importantly, the idea was for the framework to drive intergovernmental fiscal transfer reform, which is long overdue because the wrong things are being incentivized, basically. And then lastly, we were really hoping, and that's how we kind of had that template framework, is that civic actors, NGOs, social movements would use this tool to hold government accountable in terms of their climate and service delivery frameworks. That's not happened. So to conclude then, one of our challenges are that even though this reform program, the CSP, sits in National Treasury in South Africa, most of the metros don't really pay too much attention to them because the metros are so well resourced and have vast policy capability and have large contracts with PwC and the big consultancy firms to kind of be the brain of these metros. And so they don't actually have the leverage to really change in a very significant way the policy practices and priorities of the metros. Secondly, the intergovernmental fiscal reform agenda is actually a policy morass. So it's super difficult to figure out how to deal with the challenge of systemic corruption in South African municipalities, because if you do fiscal reform to address that, you're very much on the compliance end, which snuffs out innovation, of course. Or whether you, given our high unemployment numbers, almost 40% of the labor force is unemployed, very large numbers of people need access to free basic services. So, so just to work out what exactly should fiscal reform drive is not a straightforward issue, and there isn't clear political direction from any sector really on this. Then thirdly, in our experience, even though we sort of really shared this framework with a lot of civil society actors, they have just been missing in action. So there's been no strategic pressure either from the trade unions or the NGOs or social movements to really, really drive the social justice dimensions of this. And then lastly, it is still very unclear what effective institutional and political capability within city government should look like, given the legacy of bureaucratic dynamics. And I can unpack that more in the discussion time. So I'll stop here and then hand back to our chair. Thanks.
Thank you, Edgar, and thanks to all three of you. As I will take my privilege as the moderator and ask a couple of questions, and I'll request the audience to maybe make notes of their questions, because we'll come to you in just about 5 to 10 minutes. So I think three of you have spoken to different scales and also different aspects of the work of enabling transition. So from on-ground implementation in the TNUSSP to discussing through these larger conceptual and access issues in terms of land and property rights, to a framework that can become a tool for people or governments to work on the transitions. So what I wanted to ask you is that in all the three sort of presentations or reflections, we saw a number of leverage points that you each sort of spoke to or alluded to, and we noticed that. And I wanted you to maybe take one of those from each other's presentation might be, and share something, how that would translate in your context per se. And I'm actually particularly thinking about institutional design and also the role of the state, which I think, Edgar, you sort of ended with, but I think I want to pick up from there. And Colin, I know you didn't share that much on the African cities work that you've been doing, but maybe if you could put that hat on, that how some of the TNUSSP work or what Edgar just presented might look like in some of the spatial contexts that you have been working on. Yeah, or if you have suggestions for each other on to take this work forward, that's also most welcome. Anybody wants to start, or? Okay, Kavita is looking very stressed, so maybe I can ask Colin. I see you smiling.
Right. Thanks, Kavita, for dodging that. Well, let me talk to the African cities story, because our visit to TNUSSP was part of a research project that looked at 7 cities, but in Africa, across Africa, but 3 in particular: Beira in Mozambique, Mwanza in Tanzania, and Freetown in Sierra Leone. And what really brings out the difference that TNUSSP made in its operation is that in the interactions with the sanitation officials and civil society people working on sanitation in those 3 cities, it was all very much focused on improving individual access to sanitation. So things like pit latrine programs, delivering slabs, and schemes to try and build better on-site systems, because the attempts to try and connect into a citywide system are just way beyond the financial capacities of those particular cities. And so the moment that you focus then on the individual is that and people seem to completely forget that most people in those cities are living in what we might call informal settlements, where the property rights are unclear, hugely unjust, and really unfair. And yet it's as if the sanitation system is going to somehow just override all the interests that are sitting in those property rights. And so where TNU SSP was really strategic is by working, it seems, with those common parts of that were kind of already existing in some kind of way. And I really like the way that Kavita pointed to paying attention to the stability of the existing system, because I think that that's a really, and we often forget in the rush to critique, what's going wrong and how to make it better, what is making the current system work and what's holding it in place. And I think, so for me, linking to that first part of your question, Geethika, I think that for me, that's a really strategic leverage point, is paying attention to the stability of the existing system.
Yeah, and could you maybe give an example in a city what that might look like in one of the cities that you spoke to?
Of the stability of the existing.
Yeah.
Well, again, coming at it from a kind of a land point of view, if we take Freetown, there's a huge willingness to try and provide public toilets, particularly to the informal settlements, which are extraordinarily dense. And yet there's no land. They regularly run into this problem that there's no land to build a public toilet, or no one wants to give up their land to build a public toilet, or no one wants the public, the kind of the NIMBY issue that Kavita pointed to. No one wants the toilet next to them. And so people keep trying to build public toilets, and the odd NGO comes along and builds a demonstration unit, and then 6 months later it collapses because there's no maintenance and it's whatever. But what's behind that is a very vibrant land market and behind the land market are some very old Sierra Leonean families who control vast tracts of Freetown's land. And so they would, I mean, I don't know, maybe it sounds a bit bad, but the imperative or the incentive is rather to put another unit that they can rent out than create space for a public toilet. And so the stability of the system is guaranteed by those old families who have control of the land in kind of vast kinship networks
Mm.
that attempts to kind of put a public toilet on just fail.
Yeah. They need to make it lucrative for them to have a public toilet, to run a public toilet.
Yeah, that would, in that system, that would be the only way that you find a solution. Where, of course, the funds don't exist to do that, so it's just this complete stasis.
Yeah. Thanks, Colin. Edgar, do I see you? Cool.
Yeah. So just to sort of think through the relevance of the case study and for South Africa. So what we found is in this work is that so we've got a very unique set of problems. So we've got a growing urban poor population that has inadequate access to basic services. Unemployment rates within those households can be up to 60, 70%. But we do have a redistributive fiscal framework, so a minimum of basic services are guaranteed to those households. And so that mitigates some of the worst excesses of urban inequality. The problem is that you can't maintain the existing network system and extend that system into these areas within the overall fiscal framework, where the cross-subsidy grows year on year because the number of indigent households is growing because of the macroeconomic challenge that we have. So that's the one issue. Secondly, because the sort of informal and the formal public housing system drives urban sprawl, the unit cost of service extension goes up exponentially in those areas as well. So that's sort of the core of the fiscal challenge that you have. So, and so what is very clear is that the only institutional workaround you can do is to begin to look at non-network system solutions that are nature-based in some way. Secondly, you have to think of social enterprises from those communities to operationalize and manage those systems. Thirdly, you've got to make sure that the institutional design of those things can be embedded in how the sanitation and waste department in the Metro government is organized. And they are completely ill-equipped to do this. And in fact, they're resistant. And so to see, sort of, and then the fourth point is that when you make that institutional investment to create capability within very poor communities for social enterprises to run some of these things, it doesn't make sense to just restrict it to sanitation, for example. You've got to look at a broader package of urban interventions around nature-based solutions for cleaning water and riverine systems, maintaining green spaces, even potentially doing micro mini grids, sort of for renewable energy solutions, running different kinds of mobility, micro mobility systems, et cetera, et cetera. That implies a framework that can really, really promote community-based service delivery institutions that is in some ways resourced and managed and embedded in by the public system. So most of our metropolitan authorities are not willing to go there. It's like just too complicated, and they definitely can't account in terms of the public accounting legal frameworks for the resources to do that stuff. Secondly, the engineers are trained to do conventional sector-based network solutions. So for them, this is simply risk. Thirdly, the social movements in these communities, they only focus on housing and land. So they're not willing to reinvent themselves to take on the social enterprise function as a way of demonstrating that you can build civic muscle in different formats. In other words, there's a repertoire of civil society action that is so ingrained that it's very difficult to create demand for this model from the bottom up, if you know what I mean. Because there's still a default setting. The state promised a certain form of resource and infrastructure, and that's the only thing we want. And if we don't get it, we'll either protest or we'll wait, right? And so that's sort of, so for me, I think that you've cracked a lot of the institutional design piece on the sort of community end of things. Is like, how do you organize these systems? How do you manage them? How do you maintain them, etc.? Because you've got a functioning system that has grown very quickly within less than a decade. I mean, that is absolutely remarkable, right? And so how to think about extrapolating the institutional lessons from that and what transfer to a South African context or an African context might mean, that's a huge question for me. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks, Edgar. I wanted to say that in all my conversations with practitioners in South Africa, the biggest bottleneck somehow in formal upgrading is engineers. Everybody, all the non-engineer practitioners sort of hate engineers. So maybe Kavita, in your response, if you could also add if you had such an encounter with engineering, and like how did you sort of make them come to your side of FSM?
Yeah, I mean, I was going to respond to that, but all due apologies to engineers in the room and online. Nothing personal. It's just our experience with engineers. But so apologies to you. But I actually, before you even asked, Gitika, I really wanted to respond to that point of Edgar's because it so resonated. And we talk, it's mostly engineers, but I think it's also other government officers. They have been trained to do certain things a certain way. And actually, that's what we realized was also a lot of resistance because you're asking them to do something they've never done, right? So it's like a lot of resistance, particularly engineers. And also, the bigger point which Edgar was driving at is I think it's particularly true that we think certain systems will work and certain others will not. And even if we accept that this system will work like a certain new system X, only that will work. And I think what we've been saying, and that I didn't put in my messages, but what we've been saying is that it is not an or thing. It is not this or that. It is and. You will need the sewerage network. You will need the FSM. You sometimes that might not work. So maybe this fancy toilet will come along, which will solve all your problem. Then please put that in. But this false duality of, I mean, we approach technical questions as saying that, oh, they're technical, but actually they're deeply political, and you don't have to make those forced choices. So that was to responding to Edgar. But the other thing to your question of levers, the reason I panicked was I know you were going to ask this question, but I teach about leverage points, but the thing is I kind of also what Edgar said, that I don't remember the exact word when he said that he doesn't know what the physical reform and the intergovernmental transfer is supposed to drive. Is something I also wonder, like, what are these leverage points? And I'll give you an example. So we used all the three, just to say what Edgar mentioned: regulatory instrument, fiscal and financial instrument, advocacy, governance. We used all of them more or less. But see, the point is sometimes you can't predict. So the biggest leverage point, and this may not have come across very clearly in our conversations, is that typically non-network systems in sanitation or water or even other things cost substantially less. And even if they don't cost less in abstract, the public investments are less because you're building on existing systems that the communities may have, or the communities are putting in that investment, which may not be an ideal solution in the issues of inequality, but still the public investment comes at a manageable range, right? So that was in a way a lever. And I remember the changing point for us to go from demonstration, which failed, like I said, to a statewide thing was this slide that we had put up, and we called it State Investment Plan, and essentially showed that what we had put a figure of around 30 USD million, which they would cover one or two cities in that money. We would cover practically reach 75% of the population, and that did flip, and that was a leverage. But the resistance we encountered, and it was not so much, but the resistance now other sector practitioners are encountering in other states and places in India is, it costs less. It's good, right? Well, yes, but not if there are commissions in place, if there is understanding with big contractors. And so perversely the sector, and I mean, again, it's a sector thing, not us, is facing a pushback precisely because it's cost effective. Now, what does this tell me about liver of change, right? And I think the bigger point I think is that, I mean, Colin said it that they have to, or you put it in Colin's mouth, but you have to make it lucrative for them. I think the thing is to work with the political economy. It's very important at all levels. And well, this is not about selling your soul, but really to understand what are the incentives and how can you work around them. So that's my bigger lesson. I mean, all these, it's good to think through levers of change, of course, but you don't know in real life how they'll emerge. So, yeah.
Yeah, when that lever is gonna work the other direction. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, thank you. I think I do have a couple of more questions, but maybe I'll take some from the audience first, and then come back to them in the end. Okay, Kavita, do you think you can ask for the mic?
Are there any questions in the room? So Gautam,
maybe let's collect 3.
Hi, Jennifer here. So thank you for the insightful panel and presentation. So my question was to Kavita. I was really interested in knowing the process that went behind IIHS becoming a part of this technical unit. Like, what was the kind of appointment processes or the selection process? How were the partners selected? So if you could share, something related to that. Thanks a lot.
So thanks so much for that, guys. Well, 2 questions, one for Kavita and one for Edgar, but Colin, feel free to jump in as well. So just to, Kavita, you used the word when you were thinking about design and uncertainty, right? This thing there. I'm just thinking also about the idea of lessons as things that are then applied when you get to do it again. But when you take uncertainty as constitutive, right? So a lot of these things one doesn't know while it's going on. So I'm thinking then about this idea of design the next program, design the next thing. And I'm wondering if some part of this, what you're saying, also makes me think that our notions of design, whether it is of a toilet or of a program, actually has to begin to really think about how to constitutively anticipate uncertainty and make room for it a bit better. And what does that do to the act of designing, right? Because it sort of it almost wants you to anticipate and control, right? Scenarios, planning, modeling. There's so much of this. But every time I hear a reflection from practice, it's about uncertainty unintended, right? So does one just sort of let go of a certain kind of design control, but then does that leave us unprepared? So I'm kind of thinking of even as all the things you intended fell away, what part of that original design imagination was still valuable? And in an abstract, what does uncertainty then do to the idea of designing programs? So that's the thing I thought. And Edgar, I wanted to slightly tangential and existential, and the same question to you as well, because I think it's in a similar thing, right? If you were to say that you embrace uncertainty a bit more, or maybe even skepticism in designing a large framework that the Presidential Commission asks you for, then is there a way that skepticism can be productive in the way you design the framework? Like, where's the role for the skepticism? Where's the role for, it's like what we say to architects. If we keep telling you things are informally built, why doesn't your architecture change to anticipate that form? And the other small thing I wanted to ask you was, you said that the mayors don't take the CSP seriously, even though the CSP is built for them and they're in it, right? It's an odd thing to not take yourself seriously. And I know the context of it being that they don't need the money from the national government the same way. But, the relationship between different scales of government is never only fiscal. There's a lot else. This is the same party, right? So I'm also wondering, why aren't there other counter forces of the ANC government in Pretoria saying to the ANC government in Johannesburg, look, for the sake of the party, do better, even if not for the sake of needing my money? So where are the non-fiscal political games that make a mayor, because when I look at something like the CSP, I'm like, this would be amazing in India. Our urban governments having a place in Delhi, right? And now you're telling me you've got it and you don't seem to want it. So it's like, what the hell? So I'm just wondering, do the non-fiscal intergovernmental politics not push in a different direction? Are they a lever?
maybe your presentation presented about solid waste management rules 2016, right? 2016 and 18. But what I feel is instead of moving all this fecal out of the local urban area, you can use this biodigesters, which was recently introduced in some urban and sanitation, this one. And even solid waste management, I don't suggest that you move out all the wet waste. Dry waste can be moved out, but wet waste, we can use a decomposter in the local area itself. Maybe that is one aspect in where it can counter the both the things. That is what I felt. We can just add upon it. Thank you.
Thank you.
So,
Kavita, do you want to start? You have a
Yep.
number of questions.
Okay, yeah, I'll answer
Okay.
fast. Or so, how was IIHS selected? So, the government of Tamil Nadu were anyway planning to expand FSM, and they got in touch with us because we had done trainings with them on sanitation. At that time, they informally got us on board, and the scope was much less than what we had. And then the Gates Foundation, so we were funded by the Gates Foundation. They jumped in, they were in conversation with the government, and we did a scoping study for them, kind of to prove that we understood the topic, which was a smaller study. And then in that way, then we got on to the, yeah. But since you didn't ask that question, but at the point I want to make here, which I missed, is also I think we did have a government officer at this very space speaking about it, and I just want to bring out that what he highlighted was a role of a place like IIHS, which is a non-profit, or in the case of Edgar and university, I think that's very important because this being led or co-designed by non-profits and universities as opposed to private sector folks, I think there's a difference. Gautam, thanks for asking that question because I had dropped that point because I didn't have time, so I can answer it now. So I just want to, before I answer it, I want to say that yes, we hear a lot about uncertainty, and there's a lot of frustration that people say, oh, but this is so obvious why things don't change. But there are 2 points there that we figure out. That one is, actually, they say seeing is believing, but when these things happen, there's often nothing to see, right? Because if you're looking at decentralized systems, people haven't seen decentralized sanitation system at scale or energy, and so people cannot imagine. And so it's very important to give them demonstration things to kind of reimagine that. And many a time people don't want to take the risks. They are risks, and we don't know the process. So when we talk about transition, and that's another point, we talk a lot about what the transition should look like, but I don't think we think about that if this transition is going to happen, what changes in law, etc., are required. Having said that, no, I don't think you let go completely, but I do think there is an element of being adaptive. There's no doubt about it. But there are some things you can do, and I think one specific thing is to collect data and information and knowledge. I wouldn't say data, I would say knowledge, and that also has its own constraint because there's never enough money and never enough time, but you can try to solidify the knowledge base, right? That's one. Second is, in terms of process, is to do collective decision making. So the very important thing which we didn't mention is that we had the government constituted an advisory committee meeting which had all senior officers and us and some of the key donors. And what we would do is we would say, these are the options, these are the risks. And then it would be a session of brainstorming. And so you were, bringing in all perspectives in one place and taking those things. And third is you have to do some demonstration. So you don't have to do pilots, but some kind of demonstration. But what TNUSSP or Tamil Nadu government did, and this is the thing of the transition theory, that we didn't wait for that to get over to start scaling. So, but you had to reach some degree of certainty. And yeah, and you have to know your risk. I think they were very clear on the risk. How much risk are you willing to take? So that's my response. Oh, and so to your answer, I mean, we also have tried biodigester, but this completely goes to my point is, it is not about biodigester versus FSM versus centralized system. I think there's a space for all of them in India and elsewhere, and everybody may have a viewpoint on what is better, but ultimately you're going to need every possible solution. Over to Edgar, I guess. Gitika?
Yes. Thanks, Kavita.
Thanks. Someone should have told me Gautam was in the room, so I would have been a little bit more circumspect about what I'm saying. So I want to respond to the first question that about uncertainty. I know Kavita has addressed that. So, but just to pick up on that, and how can one reimagine or rethink policy processes that can anticipate an uncertainty? So I think from our experience working both with the City of Cape Town, the Western Cape Regional Government, and different national departments, I think where I'm at on this is that it is very clear to me that public sector institutions need their procedures for certainty, right? They operate on the basis of certainty. So this is their budgets, their annual performance plans, the blah, 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 blah. There's like a million of these things. And they can't live without them, both for legal reasons, but I think also for a sense of professional clarity and certainty and belonging. I think the challenge is to say is how does one take those systems and build reflection points into their operations and subvert those reflection moments. And the way to do that, I think, is really to suggest or to encourage the idea of the living lab or the lab that is a mechanism that helps that system to learn more effectively. And then there's, of course, now we've got a big literature on this. We've experimented with at least a dozen different versions of labs over the last 18 years. But that lab idea, which can extract sort of new insight, codify that, which can lead to new practice, but also validate. So for me, the main thing about the public bureaucracy is that you've got to spot the bureaucratic innovators. So the people across the system that you can somehow harness to work with the lab as a way of creating a framework for innovation to emerge. And then lastly, you've got to incentivize innovation. So there's got to be ways in which those people who are willing to break the mold or operate at the edge of the mold is kind of validated outside of just the professional norms. So they get asked to speak or to teach in the class. They get asked to go to an international conference, to blah, blah, blah. So, so I think for me, that's kind of where things could be at. Just some ideas on that. On the CSP and your very specific question about political alignment. So I think the mistake the CSP made, which I've discussed with them, is that in their second incarnation, which in the sort of, they've had this, they now just started their third life. In their second life, they abandoned something called the Built Environment Performance Plan. This was a new planning instrument only for the metros. And what this instrument had to do was to produce an additional plan that analyzed the political economy of space, why spatial inequality is reproduced, and then identified investment points or nodal points within the city that can begin to reverse the logics of land markets and then aggregate and stack different infrastructure and other real estate investments into those nodes. The CSP in its second life incentivized that by providing very generous planning grants to help the metros produce these additional plans. And those plans had to be debated in council and approved by council before it was submitted to National Treasury. And at the end of that was the carrot of very, very significant subsidies of 2-3 billion rand if the metros implemented these feasibility plans. The metros bitched about this. They didn't want to do it. We've got enough plans, blah, blah, blah. But actually, when we spoke to a lot of the metros, they all said that was actually the thing that forced change, because there was money, the local treasury got behind it. And secondly, because it was something that council approved, it had traction within the administration. It had validity. And in fact, it was the only thing that the planners felt gave them some power in the system. In phase 3, that instrument has been abandoned by CSP. And so they've just become another technical office that provides technical advice that no one wants. And even the way there's an alignment politically with the ANC or whatever, the ANC political factions are even more divided than the ANC and the DA, which is the opposition political party, or the ANC and the EFF. So I'll just leave it at that, and you can decode what I mean. Thanks.
Thanks, Edgar. I'm just going to apologize. Is it okay if we go like 5-10 minutes over? in the room and online space? 5 minutes?
Yes, Neha saying yes to 10 minutes,
Cool.
5-10 minutes, yeah.
Okay, cool. So maybe Edgar, you leave after 5 minutes. I'll give you the last moment just now. But Colin, if you want to come in on any of the questions that were asked in the room, but could I also give you a task of the online question where it is asked, this person from Portugal who's asking that, what does this mean in the context of Global North, which also is now facing a lot of actually the similar issues? What does it mean for urban development more broadly in the sense, like, and not just Global South and where we are, from where we are coming in this session? So if I could give you that hard job. And the next question that's online, I'm actually just going to request you to please reach out to us individually because there are a range of questions and we can take them offline. I'm so sorry, Aishwarya. I won't be able to take it.
Would you like me to come in now, Geetika? Okay, I was hoping to dodge that first question because it's a very good question, but it's a huge one, and I was just pretending that it didn't exist there, having read through it a couple of times. So thank you for asking me to reply to that. Yeah, honestly,
Okay.
I don't know where to start with that question. It's a very good one. I think that there are so many ways in which we need to understand the interdependencies between the two, between the kind of global north and global south, and using that story that we've yet to learn and which could enrich the story. So I think that Edgar's going to write an answer. Great. No, okay. So
We'll make this our next panel.
Exactly.
I want to answer it like that. This will be the focus of our next panel discussion.
If not a whole conference. Sorry.
Absolutely, yes. But yeah, thank you for that question.
At the one point I wanted to make just about this uncertainty is I think that there might be something to learn, and I don't know where this would fit in the whole story because I understand the certainty that institutional systems and governments need, but I think learning from this new move in feminism to embrace ambivalence can be something that could be very interesting, because what ambivalence allows you to do is recognize and try and work with these contradictions that we face. And I know in just as much as India as in South Africa, the contradictions are just so stark and so everyday and so in your face all the time that that there's perhaps something to work with, to explore ambivalence as a mode of operating. How that fits with government bureaucracies and formal systems, I don't know yet, but maybe there's something in the ambivalence. And I mean, usually feminism is way above, in terms of social theory, feminism is usually at the forefront. So maybe we can learn from the feminists around uncertainty and ambivalence.
Thanks, Colin. Edgar, before I let you go, or you go by your own volition, I just wanted you to maybe I want you to respond to this question on, like, what has all this meant to you as an individual? Like you mentioned about the process being very messy, sticky. As an individual, how did you navigate or like sort of dealt with it? And what does all this work sort of mean individually? Okay.
Okay. Wow. Okay. Nice and tidy little small question there before I run. So maybe just to very quickly explain the process. So we did the policy report in the first year, and it was a team of us. Anton Cartwright led the team, and there were 4 other colleagues. So in that period, I was just the ignoramus because climate isn't my field. So I was just a sponge and learning from them. So that was fantastic. I was kind of getting into a set of debates that I always feel guilty that I don't know enough about, especially after I've been in Aro's company. So that, it was the first year, I guess. And then the same was because CSP3 was gearing up to see CSP1 dying and CSP3 being born. with, to kind of have that insight into how completely arbitrary and messy and uncertain the public policy space is, even in National Treasury, which is supposed to be the most stable and most, sort of organized national sector department. So that was, from an institutional ethnographic point of view, fascinating to experience. And then in last year, from May up until November, I facilitated a monthly workshop with the CSP team, because they realized that before they can really drive this with the metros, they need to, across their own programmatic thematics, transport, waste, whatever else, they needed to have a better handle on what the just urban transition approach actually means for them. And so to kind of facilitate that monthly workshop last year, yeah, I mean, it's like, government is complicated, the policy stuff is messy, but to kind of get the nitty-gritty and the detail of it, it felt like I was running a focus group every month. So the learning was incredible for me. So I felt incredibly privileged to have that in an insider perspective from very senior and seasoned senior policy leaders. And then at the end of that, to kind of arrive at the conclusion, and this is not, for the public record, but, that this thing ain't going to work. Like, we just don't have the pieces in place for this framework to be implemented in any significant way over the next 2.5 years of this administration that is left. And so the question I was left with after the last workshop was, like, what is the one thing within all of these moving parts that would feel like a step forward, that is worth reinforcing in our final workshop that is happening in February? And I don't know the answer to that yet. So I'll end there. Thanks.
Cool. If you want to leave, it's okay. Thank you so much for being here. And I'll continue with Colin and Kavita briefly. Kavita, if you were to...
Everyone, thanks so much. Appreciate it.
Thanks, Edgar.
Thanks, Edgar.
If you were to share, your navigation, or moving through this almost a decade. I know Mahima said, but I thought it started in 2015 and we're in 2025. So what would that be?
We'll have a lot more white hair. But no, I think echoing some of Edgar's thing, and because Gitika is doing a PhD on practitioners and their life histories, and what she keeps on saying, they like to hear how everybody's in a mess. So I would just say that it's been an incredible learning experience. And in my career trajectory, there will always be life before TNUSSP and after TNUSSP. No matter, we're a name, we say that, okay, it's all working now. Maybe 5 years down the line, we don't know, it may just collapse. But nevertheless, it's been a learning journey. And just to say that, to people who are working in this, that it's incredibly frustrating. And what Edgar said is it's zig and zag, and it's up and down, and it's not linear. So I guess that's the thing. And second is that, your point about leverage point on, theory of change, I'm very, very, I have hope because we managed to get change, and there are many other examples of things changing, but also very of packaged wisdom, let me put it this way. So, yeah.
Okay, thank you. Colin, lastly to you, and on of course being in this space, but also if you were to write a sticky note to yourself in this moment, that you sort of come back to whenever you start thinking through transitions or this kind of work again, what would that be? Where would you begin?
Well, I really liked Kavita's point that scaling and institutional reform are not the same thing, because there's been a big move within the teaching that we do, that how do you scale up and how do you get spatial justice across a city or greater social justice across a city. And that distinction hasn't been part of the story yet. So on my sticky note, it would be scaling and institutional reform are not the same. Thank you, Kavita.
Great. Cool. I think I'm at the extension of 10 minutes now. So thank you so much, Neha, for giving that. And thank you so much for organizing this panel. And thanks to all the seamless tech that has sort of come through. I feel like when I'm doing a hybrid thing, I can only do it with IIHS. I don't think I can do it with other folks. So thank you so much for everything. And thank you to Colin and Kavita and Edgar and Mahima. For leading this excellent discussion. I think there's lots of food for thought here.